here in this very important webinar. I have not prepared my PowerPoint, and my contribution is I want to look at this issue, both the territorial dispute and the issue of oil and gas corporations from a historic and economic development point of view. This is a little bit unusual, but I hope that it can add value to this webinar. First, from the historical perspective, let us realize that territorial dispute is older than the notion of statehood. Even before human civilizations, we already have people fighting over territories. So it's right to say that territorial dispute is actually longer than human civilizations. But after we realize this, we have to ask the next question. How come until today, we don't have very satisfactory solutions on these centuries of problems? Now, historically, territorial disputes were settled by peaceful means or non-peaceful means. But I think everybody realized, very unfortunately, the non-peaceful means actually dominate human history in solving territorial problems. So this is something that we have to take in mind. If we don't take this thing carefully, this thing spillover effect can be very serious. Now, among cases settled by peaceful means, third-party arbitration is a very rare occurrence, and it only covers very minor disputes. Most peaceful settlement actually involves bilateral negotiations. In this regard, you'd be surprised to know that China has been the most active in recent history in settling peaceful settlement disputes. China has the longest land border in the world. It runs more than 22,000 kilometers. And it has successfully settled more than 18,000 with 11 neighboring countries by negotiations. Only 3 countries China has not settled the border delineations: India, Pakistan, and Nepal. Now, why we bring this point up is that if you look at historical lessons, that bilateral negotiation is the dominant mode of the territorial settlement. Now, it reflects just simple that any territorial dispute is an emotional issue. It's already not an issue of legal right or wrong. It's already that people are attached to the place that they think belong to them. And of course, the other thing is that it's very hard. And right now, there's no satisfactory settlement rules. Now, only by bilateral negotiations, both sides can be happy. In fact, most of the countries refuse third-party intervention, if you look at human history, talking about territorial settlement. Now, third-party arbitration is always very difficult. If you look at these angles from the history of territorial dispute settlement, actually, this issue belongs to the realm of geopolitics and diplomacy, more than it depends on any legal framework that you can think of. I'm talking about history, and these are all facts that everybody realized. And right now, if we talk about why no third-party settlement rules is satisfactory, you must understand that the present international law overlooks the fact that you have issues of heritage, you have issue of cultures, and you have issue of emotions inside any territorial discussions. Now, right now, when people talk about that, there's no such an historical claim. They just forget, if you look at the case of Israel, this is the best case in the world human history that the historical claims does matters and does counts. And of course, it's very important that why historical is being belittled. Because if you look at the colonial history, like in the case of the Philippines, when the Spaniards came, they just declared the whole country under the king's rule. And that is where the Hacienda history started. All the native barangays, communal land, were declared null and void. So the issue that the historical claim is not a valid issue, carry a lot of judgment calls. Now, of course, we talk about peaceful means, we already settled that. Based on human history, bilateral negotiation is the mode. And if you are not very careful, it can easily split into non-peaceful means. Now, if you look at the non-peaceful means of territorial claim, you realize that it is actually always the result of a war. And then after the war, there's always a peace talk. And the subsequent peace treaty just legalize whatever the victor's claim is. Now, if you remember the statement, whether attributed to Winston Churchill or wrong, that history is written by the victor is a very, very sad, but a very, very historical true statement. Now, after this, let us look at the modern warfare. If you look at what happened today in Russia and Ukraine, and I think today is getting to 150 days. Now, there are now 6 forces operating in this new era of fighting. You have the traditional land war, sea war, air war, and then you have these nuclear strategic warfares. And right now, you can already see that we have cyber warfares and space warfares. So the war today is getting very, very complicated. And after looking at this, you realize that how many countries can afford to fight this kind of war? And everybody knows that the 2 top contenders is the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. Now, if you look at the widening gap between the military powers and the other countries, because of this industrial revolution, which is actually have all the precedents in the early industrial revolutions. In each industrial revolution, you have new military power emerging. Now, it's very sad for other countries. If you look at this war, we have the autonomous weapons now being come in, the drones, and you have precision weapons, the HIMARS. And if you look at all this, you realize that the cost of war today, actually for those military powers, is getting lower and lower because human casualty is being cut. But for the other countries, it is getting more destructive. You just look at the footage of any Ukrainian cities. You know what that means. They live in rubles more than any other thing you can imagine. So it is very important that if there's a territorial dispute, which is always happening in human history, we must look for peaceful means of resolving it. The cost of war today is just too much. Now, very luckily, what happened between China and the Philippines is maritime territories. And again, if you look at human history, resolving maritime territorial dispute is a lot easier than the land dispute. And the reason is very simple. Because if you look at the sea dispute, always the center is on resources. Of course, number one thing is always fishing. And right now, of course, with this UNCLOS, you have the mineral rights and you have this oil and gas. Now, another thing is that in the sea territorial dispute, because it's not really where the people live, the attachment to the sea is much less than the attachment to the land. So many people actually don't consider the sea dispute as a challenge to national patrimony. And that is very important. Now, if you realize that, I'm sorry I did not prepare the slides, but I shared it with Anna, is that even though one of the biggest gas field in the world between Qatar and Iran is cut across the boundary, and they have worked out a means to share all the gas recovered. This is one of the biggest gas field in the world. So if you look at the Mediterranean seas, they have a lot of islands, and how they look at the fishing right. So they have very peaceful means of resolving it. So this one actually brings us to the issue of, if you take a look at oil and gas as an economic interest, and maritime territory is more about economic interest, this should form a very background to the peaceful resolution of the current issues. So if you look at our webinar topic, oil and gas joint development corporations, I think that if the mechanism can be worked out well and explained properly to the people, there is a chance that you will have public support. So I look at the angles from the historical perspective, because I must admit, I'm never an expert in geopolitics, law of the sea, law of the oceans, but I just look at things of what had happened before in human history, and I hope that that can help. Now, after looking at it from the historic perspective, let us look at it now from the development economics perspective. Because my profession, I'm trained as a development economist. And of course, when you train as a development economist, there's a heavy dose of historical precedents that I study. What really happened to those countries who succeeded in economic development, and who are the countries who failed in economic development, and what are the lessons that we can draw? Okay, the first question I want to pose to the audience is this. Everybody now talk about the weather. China this year is a very abnormal weather. Many places is over 40, and then you have floods in somewhere. And Europe, in the US, is scorched earth, okay? So many countries over 40 degrees. Now, the commitment to climate is definitely something we cannot get away. If the climate changes proceed at this rate, human civilization is going to change dramatically. Our survival is at stake. In fact, Southeast Asia is in a very difficult situation. I study this climate change and must tell you that if you go to Navotas today, you know how many places can easily get flooded in the high tide, okay? The ocean is really rising. The water is intruding. Now, this question is this. So many countries now commit to so-called zero carbon emission by 2050, 2060. Okay. Now, you know that one of the biggest economic victims of carbon neutralization is oil and gas, because they are the one producing the carbon dioxide that warm the planets. So if you realize that, I pose this question, shall we exploit the oil and gas today when they are very valuable? Because right now in Manila, everybody is suffering from this high price of gasoline. But you can already foresee, over the long term of 20, 30 years, oil and gas importance to global economy is going to be diminished, whether we like it or not, because we have no choice but to phase them out. So, number one thing, are we going to fight over an asset that the value is diminishing by emotions? Very objectively, from development economics point of view, let's be realistic. Get them out first off the ground and help the economy as soon as you can. Now, everybody knows that military expenditure is a consumption and not an investment in most countries. Only those countries who build arms, like the Nazi Germany, need an arm industry. Most of the others who buy arms realize that military expenditure is a waste. That is why you have a classical saying, economics, a choice between gun and butter. You can only choose one. Okay? Now, it is without dispute that all countries need a very peaceful environment to focus on economic development. It is a reality that a benign external environment is a necessary condition for economic development. And I think in the case of China, nobody talked about it more often than Mr. Deng Xiaoping, who initiated the reform. Now, however, we know that a benign external peaceful environment is a necessary condition for economic takeoff. But this alone is not sufficient for takeoff. If we want economic takeoff, we need corresponding domestic reforms. Whatever the gas and oil and gas bonanza can bring you cannot alone to move the country forward. This is one point we have to explain to the people. We need a necessary international benign environment. We want capital money coming from the oil and gas, but we must also work hard. Okay. Now, there is a story I want to suggest both the Filipino and the Chinese audience take a look. If you remember, in 1960, South Korean per capita GDP was only 60% of the Philippines, 1960. But today, South Korea per capita GDP is 10 times the Philippines. So in the economic takeoff of South Korea, we have a story called the miracle of the Han River. Now, Han River is the river that cut across Seoul. If you look at the miracle of Han River, the normalization of Japan-Korea relationship is play a very important role. So there was a treaty that President Park Chung-hee signed in 1965 with Japan called the 1965 Korea-Japan Normalization Treaty. That one played a very important role. And if these oil and gas explorations can bring similar benefit to the Philippines, I think all Filipino peoples would love to have it. Okay? Now, there's so many details in this. But again, the miracle of Han River is available in Wikipedia and everywhere. Please look at it and see how the whole process runs. Now, I must say this way. The treaty remains a little bit controversial today because all those comfort women, all those forced labor issues in the Japanese colonial history in South Korea were absorbed under this treaty. But this treaty did bring tangible effect, benefits to the South Koreans. Now, and again, this miracle of Han River, personally, I believe, is a very good example of how a good external relationship helps jumpstart a country. This is very important. We have to learn from history, how others did it, how are we going to replicate it, and modify to suit our conditions. Now, President Marcos is very right to point out that the relationship between China and the Philippines is a multidimensional one, and we should focus on the positive sides. However, I must caution you, the framing of the 1987 constitutions, ignoring the difference between territorial water and exclusive economic zone, will always make the president's legal position not as strong as you like. Now, in these constitutions, you must remember under UNCLOS, every country has 12 nautical miles of territorial waters. But the 200 nautical mile refer to exclusive economic zone. So that means from the 188, from the 13 to 100 to the 200, the country does not exercise exclusive sovereignty. It just has control over economic interests. But unfortunately, in 1987, legal experts do not look at this issue very closely. So I have seen that in the initial negotiations, everybody talk about sovereignty. So I'm sorry to point this thing out, and it's very unfortunate. So it is very important for the whole issue being discussed openly with all the legal argument and economic argument being put forward very carefully. And I'm sure that the citizenry will support an enlightened government to have this idea pushed forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Henry. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Henry is also the adjunct research fellow at the Integrated Development Studies Institute. So if you listen to Dr. Henry, he is trying to lay ground the historical, somewhat historical perspective to the issue of